300 AD. Earth has been overrun by an incurable virus. All attempts to contain the disease have failed, and the wealthy and powerful flee the planet in search of a new start. On board are 10,000 citizens, all secured in deep stasis and watched over by a team of loyal androids. Stasis, a technology still not fully tested, has in some rare cases led to permanent psychological damage due to the onset of nightmares from which they cannot awaken. This citizen finds himself in the Whitechapel district of London in 1888. This area became infamous for being the hunting ground of Jack the Ripper, who over the course of just over 2 months was believed to have abducted and brutally murdered 5 young women. In some cases, the victims were so horrifically mutilated that it took extensive legwork by the police to be able to identify the bodies. After the first 3 deaths, word had spread all over London's East End, and the women who worked the streets at night were faced with the horrific reality that the very thing they were forced to do in order to survive was the very same thing that exposed them to the killer and a violent, untimely death. The whole district was on high alert, and even though there was an increased police presence in the area, the murders would continue. Our citizen in stasis, believing he is an inspector tasked with finding the culprit behind the murders, sits in a local pub having his supper, when out of the corner of his eye, he notices something very strange indeed. His table was positioned at the rear of the room, giving him a clear view towards the kitchen beyond. The view of the filthy kitchen was a sight he could tolerate. However, it wasn't until he saw the enormous tail of a rodent that his stomach truly turned. Disgusted, he stood up from his table, drew his truncheon, and crept as silently as he could toward the filthy animal. His plan to smash it over the head halted as he realized he wasn't looking at a wild creature. He was in fact staring at a fully clothed humanoid rat that was rapidly filling a bag with scraps. "Oi!" he shouted, and the rat-like creature, startled, turned and hissed at the inspector before rapidly disappearing into the pile of trash. The inspector was frozen where he stood, questioning what he had just seen. Was he going insane? He exited the pub and walked to the rear of the building, finding no trace of the Ratman, only more trash and more places for it to hide. On his way home, he passed by several ladies of the night, warning them all not to be there when he came back. They told him they knew the risks, but what choice did they have? To get off the street, they had to work the streets. They felt they had a better chance of fighting off or avoiding a psychopath than they did the cold or starvation. He walked away, leaving them to their fate, not having dared tell them of what else might be lurking out there, for fear of being labelled a madman himself. The next day he inquired at several taverns and restaurants, inspecting their kitchens and alleyways, asking the question about trouble with rats, to which they all laughed and said, "This is London, you know. Rats are everywhere." None of them spoke of seeing what he had witnessed though. However, he didn't prompt any of them to do so, for fear of being mocked even further. Exactly a week later, after yet another battered and mutilated body had been reported, he saw it again. While smoking his pipe in a gaslit alley, he saw the shadow of what he was certain was the Ratman. He extinguished his pipe and then made his way down the stone terrace, the light behind him fading and the road ahead stretching deeper into the darkness. His eyes slowly adjusting, he was able to make out the Ratman's shape again, heading down some stairs at the base of a building, down into the cellar below. He cautiously moved onward. With his baton in his hand, he made his way down the stairs and peered into the keyhole of the door. Even though the scene before him was shocking and bizarre, he was convinced his eyes weren't playing tricks on him this time. There was a young lady lying on the floor. The Ratman was closing in on her. The inspector was certain he had found his culprit. He burst into the room, and to his surprise, the Ratman wasn't doing anything untoward with the young lady. He was actually feeding her the scrap food. It appeared he was helping her. The startled Ratman hissed at the inspector and then disappeared into a large crack in the wall. The inspector, not seeing the need to go after him, then moved in closer to the semi-conscious lady and asked her if she was all right. Her eyes had rolled back into her head as she looked up at him and gave out a blood-curdling moan just as the sheet on her back shifted around like a pot about to boil. He then knew that things here were not right, and he was overwhelmed with a sinking feeling that they were about to get even worse. The inspector pulled back the sheet and revealed dozens of baby rats all over her body, all suckling at her flesh, drawing nutrients from her blood. As he reeled back, the door to the cellar burst open and a huge figure with glowing red eyes moved in on him. Every ounce of his being became saturated with fear, and he was unable to override his instinct to turn and run. Run as fast as he could, off into the night. Back on the ship, the android medics had been alerted to the citizens' irregular brainwaves and were monitoring them to ensure they didn't reach dangerous levels. What was of more concern, though, was the other alert they had received from another citizen in the same group of pods. The medic stood and watched the monitor in silence, trying to make sense of the anomaly. It appeared that somehow this woman had suddenly fallen pregnant. While a wry smile went undetected on the face of a citizen right next to her. This citizen, Stephen Kushner, finds himself hitchhiking on a desolate road in Middle America, his blistered feet rubbing raw against his tattered shoe leather, the pain keeping his exhausted frame awake, for he knows that if he stops moving, the cold will quickly consume him. He has no memory of the past events that put him into such circumstances, and is genuinely terrified of what future events may lay ahead. In the distance, he sees the dim lights of a vehicle approaching through the fine mist of his strained breath. He desperately wants to be picked up, to get out of the bitter cold, and to rest his poor, aching feet, but he doesn't hold much confidence in success. The last few cars rattle past him, only one acknowledging his existence with an ear-piercing blast of their horn. This time, however, was different. The truck was slowing, and eventually ground to a halt when it pulled alongside him. "Not a kind night to be out for a stroll," the deep male voice from the truck called. "No choice, I'm afraid," Stephen croaked back, squinting to make out the figure within. "I'm completely lost, and I have no idea where I'm headed." "Jump in then," the man was quick to offer. "The homestead's not far off the road ahead, and I'll give you a warm bed and supper in return for some labor." Stephen was shaken. This was exactly what he'd been wishing for, but his gut clawed at him not to commit. "Quickly then," the man boomed again, giving Stephen no time to think it through. Too cold and too rushed to think clearly, he stepped forward. "Thank you, sir. Thank you." "The name's Tom. Don't mention it. It'd be good to have some company. My wife has been on a serious cognitive decline as of late." Hearing this didn't make him feel any better, and he stayed close to his side of the cab for the duration of the ride to the farmhouse. It was a run-down old place, exactly what Steve had expected. A barn to one side, silos next to that, and other ramshackle lean-tos and half-attempted hen houses varying in states of decay scattered around. Harder to make out in the moonlight was a huge shed behind the farmhouse. Stepping out of the car, the dull odor of a piggery intensified immediately, and he pulled his scarf over his nose and mouth in an attempt to filter it out. "Don't mind the smell," the farmer started. "I can assure you, you don't smell much better." Stephen didn't disagree. He knew he must reek from being on the road for God knows how long, and even longer since he could remember his last bath. Upon entering the house, the farmer directed Steve to take a seat in the dining room while he went to the kitchen to fetch his wife and reheat some leftover stew. The dining room was dimly lit, and he scanned around the room at the unsettling and eerie choice of decorations. While looking about, he overheard the farmer talking to what he assumed was his wife in the kitchen. He couldn't make out exactly what they were saying, but sentences along the lines of, "I've found someone," and "he should do nicely," genuinely made him want to flee. But he was so hungry that he figured he would eat first and could fight off the old farmer if need be. Moments later, the farmer entered the room along with a large pot and an old frail lady by his side. She held herself close to him, for it was clear that she was completely blind. Introductions were made and dinner was served. Steve was famished, and he quickly tucked into the hot stew to quell his hunger pangs and to thaw out his frozen bones. Within minutes, Steve was finished. However, his feelings of satisfaction were short-lived as he began to feel dizzy and he watched the couple in front of him slowly blur away into darkness. "It's time," barked the farmer. Hours had passed and Steve found himself in yet another completely unfamiliar setting. He was on a couch in what was perhaps the living room? "What?" he croaked. Time for what?" "Feeding time," the farmer replied. "Come with me." Steve, still feeling extremely groggy, pulled himself to his feet and followed the farmer outside. "You passed out pretty swiftly last night," the farmer began. "Thought you might be ill, but you slept so soundly, I figured you was just exhausted." "Right," replied Steve. I'm sorry, I really don't know what happened." "It's fine," muttered the farmer. "I would have let you sleep, but you're needed." The farmer slid back the huge steel door to the piggery, and Steve was nearly knocked off his feet by the incredible stench. "Dear God," he coughed. "Ain't no God here," the farmer quipped. "These beasts be Satan's finest." Steve then reeled back at the sight of hundreds of massive, overgrown hogs stretching far into the darkness. The pens packed to capacity, and the deafening sound of the grunting and squealing assaulted his eardrums with the power of an avalanche. "It's feeding time," the farmer boomed. "They know when they see me, they're about to get fed." Stephen froze. "What do they eat?" he asked. "Anything," the farmer shot back. "Anything at all. They'll carve through an entire cow in minutes if I was to let them have it one." "Is that what you feed them?" Stephen cautiously inquired. Not sure he was going to like the answer. "Ha! Nothing that big. Have to settle with corn and grain," he grunted as he pulled a lever which opened chutes around the shed, allowing the feed to cascade into each pen, amplifying the already ear-splitting ambience tenfold. Steve watched on in awe as the pigs scrambled over each other in order to fill their greedy guts with no regard for any other. "Have to ration it though," the farmer quipped as he shut the lever off. "The supply is running low, and I can't afford to be greedy." The vision quickly made his mind flash back to when the rich and powerful were being selected for a berth on the Soteria. Men, women, and children were trampled, beaten, and shot in order to remove them from the chosen ones and allow openings for others. The true colors of the worst of all human beings had been revealed, and sadly, only the absolute worst had managed to make their way onto the ship. The select few were now the future of the human race, and Stephen was one of them. Steve then spent the next few weeks working in return for food and shelter. The farmer explained how the farm had really fallen on tough times and wasn't sure how much longer he could keep it going. Steve said he was happy to stay around as long as he was needed. He had grown less paranoid of the farmer's intentions for him and was finding it easier to relax when alone. That was until he was visited one afternoon by a large, imposing man who appeared to have just wandered onto the property. At first, his features were hard to make out. That was, until he stepped into the light, and a shock of panic ran through Steve's veins as he realized the man's eyes were weeping blood. "Stop right there," Steve snapped. This is private property. You need to leave." "I'm no threat," the man calmly replied back. "In fact, I'm here to warn you," he whispered. "The old couple are planning to feed you to the pigs." "What?" Steve hurled back at him. That's ridiculous. They like having me here. I'm helping them out." "You sure are. I mean, you sure will." Steve wanted to beat the man over the head with his shovel, but deep down he knew he was right. He knew they were plotting his end. The man smiled at Steve and spoke sternly. "Look, The name is Blacker, and I'm just here to warn you. Get out of here. Join me. I'll take you to a better place." Steve stared deep into the man's eyes and was about to speak when he was cut off by the old farmer calling out for him. Steve turned and called out, and when he turned back, the man was gone. Steve then questioning if he was even real. That night, at a time where Steve would normally be fast asleep, he lay in bed wide awake due to the trauma caused by the unpleasant encounter he had experienced earlier in the day. It was then he began to overhear the conversation between the old couple downstairs. He could only make out portions of it, but it was clear they were planning something for him when he heard his name referenced in the same sentence as, "It's time," and "I'll take care of it tomorrow." Steve didn't sleep a wink that night, on high alert for what was to come. The next morning, he rose as usual, before sunrise, and was greeted outside by the farmer who suggested that they both go and feed the pigs first thing in the morning. Are you sure you don't want me to go and fill the water truck for them first?" Steve inquired, as that was generally his first task of the day, one he would do alone. "Nope," the farmer shot back. "Need you in the piggery, now." Steve reluctantly agreed, and they entered the large steel shed with the farmer leading the way. The air was more rancid than usual, and Steve began to shake, unable to fully deal with what he knew was about to happen. "The grain ran out yesterday," the farmer started. "I can't afford any more until I get these pigs to market in a fortnight, and they'll die before then. So we have to make a sacrifice." As the words left his lips, the farmer drew a large knife from his belt and moved it forward. Steve instinctively swatted it with his hand, and it scuttled across the floor below. "What the hell are you doing?" snapped the farmer. "Getting in first," hurled back Steve as he pushed the old man over the edge and into the churning mass of the bloodthirsty pigs. The entire shed erupted with a cacophony of squealing as the farmer was torn to shreds, completely disappearing from view in a matter of seconds. Steve stood on the edge of the pen and stared down into the madness, his deep breath heaving through the clenched teeth of his manic smile. It was time to go. Stepping back into the house to pick up the keys to the truck, the old lady called out to who she thought was her husband from the living room. "Did it go okay, Tom?" Steve didn't reply. "Did he have the stomach to help you kill a few hogs for feed?" "I sure hope so. We'll show he's got what it takes to keep this place going when we're gone." Steve froze. The guilty regret of what he'd just done hit him like an icy blast. They were going to kill some pigs, to feed them to the pigs. They were going to gift him the farm. He rapidly backed out of the house in an attempt to avoid the horrific realization hitting home any harder. Shaking like a leaf, he started the truck, where he noticed Blacker was waiting for him. "You made me kill an innocent man," Steve barked. "I didn't know," Blacker calmly replied. "I do know that you're a murderer, though." "You can't tell anyone," Steve begged. "It's fine," Blacker assured him. "Stick with me and do what I say, and you'll have nothing to worry about." Back on the ship, it was noted that Steve's cognitive state had been altered, and he would have to be monitored closely to prevent any further brain damage. And in a pod, right next to his, Dan Blacker smiled, as he had now successfully recruited a lackey. This citizen, Gloria Aquino, deck officer on the spaceship's flight crew, finds herself in the small American city of Oak Ridge, Tennessee in the year 2059. As a member of the city government's public relations department, she is playing a key role in the preparation of the 100-year anniversary of the city's inauguration, which involves unearthing a time capsule that has laid dormant since 1959. There is some old lore surrounding the time capsule, in that it is not exactly known why it was placed there, or what the contents are within it either. Library archives of the day it was buried are intriguingly scarce, with entire sections of old newspapers having been removed, in what appeared to be an attempt to almost erase the entire event from history. The 100-year anniversary would have possibly gone by completely forgotten had it not been for a team of hospice staff clearing out the possessions of a deceased resident and finding a series of photographs of the event in a photo album. The event showed the city mayor and what appeared to be other dignitaries standing alongside the capsule prior to its descent into the earth below. A small newspaper clipping detailed some of the items that lay within: a wristwatch, a pipe and tobacco, a map of the city, and several other ordinary items of the time. However, one item in particular stood out to them all, and it was some form of carving showing a horned owl hovering over a house. One of the ladies who had Cherokee Indian ancestors was horrified at the sight of this, and once calmed down explained that it was an extremely bad omen and should be left where it lies at all costs. Her co-workers thought she was insane to buy into such superstition and were quick to present their findings to the city officers so it could be added to the promotional material for the centenary event. Gloria was somewhat taken aback by this find and raised her concerns with the mayor immediately, recommending that the event be cancelled. Word spread quickly about the potential contents of the time capsule, and the principal chief of the Cherokee tribe condemned the event. The mayor, the organization committee, and the majority of the public, however, completely ignored his protests and continued on with the preparations. In the nights leading up to the event, odd things began to happen around the town. Car accidents had increased in frequency, as did workplace accidents and injuries. Many put this down to people being preoccupied with the pending celebration. However, some reported sightings of a Cherokee medicine man in areas around the city each night, soon after sundown. The city was divided on these sightings and the events that people assumed were linked. The principal chief supported the claims of unfortunate events being connected, but denied any involvement. He repeated his warnings daily, and it became clear that the town was slowly becoming increasingly paranoid. The mayor's office held an emergency meeting with the topic of discussion being whether or not to go ahead with the centenary celebrations and the unearthing of the time capsule. The debate carried on for several hours, with the ultimate outcome being that they would indeed go ahead, as the mayor declared it would be ridiculous for them to give in to such unfounded superstition. Gloria wrapped up her work for the day and was leaving the city offices when she felt a distinct change in the air around her. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, and therefore made her way to her car as quickly as possible. On the drive home, she began to curse herself for not being stronger and failing to stand up to the ignorance in the room at the mayor's office. She knew that unearthing the amulet was disrespectful to the Cherokee people, and she felt horrified that it was allowed to go ahead. "I'll put a stop to it," she vowed, as she looked into the rear vision mirror to commit this to herself. It was then that she realized she was not alone. The ominous figure that sat behind her had been with her for the duration of the entire journey, and she stood on the brakes as soon as she had realized this. Gasping for breath, she managed to croak the obvious question, "Who are you?" "Not important," the shadow hissed back. "What is important is that you push for the ceremony to go ahead. It will do more for the plight of the Cherokee people than you can possibly imagine." Gloria was confused. "I don't understand," she questioned. "There's no need to. Just trust that what gets unearthed on the day will ensure that justice is served." And with that, the next moment she looked, the figure was gone. Gloria sat in silence, confused and alone. Catching her breath and trying to calm her heartbeat, which was painfully near bursting point, she was convinced she would endorse the ceremony for fear of not knowing what would happen next if she didn't. Unfortunate events continued in the town to the point where the Cherokee were experiencing more frequent persecution than usual, which, along with their silent protest over the impending ceremony, forced them all to temporarily leave the city. The day had come. Not a single full-blooded Cherokee Indian would be there to see it. Gloria was of mixed emotions. However, she was convinced that the medicine man she had spoken to had directed her to do the right thing. The capsule was excavated from its signposted location and put on display for all in attendance to see. An enormous crowd had formed to witness the opening of the capsule, all intrigued at what the full contents could be. The afternoon sky gradually darkened over the city of Oak Ridge that day, moments prior to the capsule being unlatched. The mayor said his token spiel to the crowd, twisted the cap, and lifted the steel housing off. A brilliant and sudden shock of blinding energy burst forward from the capsule, burning the eyes of every single person unfortunate enough to have been staring at it, and roasting their skin, hair, and clothing along with it. The device that had been excavated was not the treasured time capsule at all. That was actually still safe and secure much further down in the ground. The crew tasked with the excavation duties had come across, unbeknownst to them, one of the dozens of buried experimental nuclear devices clumsily hidden soon after the Second World War had come to an end. Back on the ship, Gloria's eyes wept blood, and the androids were completely perplexed as to what was going on in the A-19 cluster of stasis pods. This citizen, Diana Larson, a hugely successful financier on Earth, finds herself incarcerated in an asylum for the criminally insane. Diana was convicted of murdering all 8 board members and the secretary of her company after they voted against her proposal to launch a hostile takeover of a rival corporation. She denied the accusation. However, the meeting minutes taken by the slain secretary detailed how Diana was unanimously overruled and a heated argument had ensued. Diana was found unconscious on the floor of the room by security staff that had been alerted by gunshots. She was still clutching the pistol in her hand. During her trial, she continuously stated that she had no recollection of the events. The evidence was damning though, and the final nail in her coffin came during the prosecution's closing argument where Diana, infuriated with all that was being said about her, leapt from where she sat and bit the ear off the terrified lawyer. Her continued violent outbursts and a damning psychological assessment landed her in the situation in which she finds herself to this day. She said she didn't consider herself insane, but what person in such a compromised mental state would? Fully coherent and able to recall everything before and after the event, she deemed herself to be completely innocent and the victim of a setup. She would now have daily meetings with her psychiatrist to whom she was completely closed off from. She didn't mutter a word, still in shock and angry from how she came to be in this situation. The psychiatrist would ramble on for hours, the majority being completely incoherent gibberish. Diana felt it should be her doctor who should be locked up in here, not her. Not willing to admit to her affliction, she was subjected to electric shock therapy where she would be strapped down to a bed and then thousands of volts pulsed through her brain in an attempt to cure her mental disorder. Outside of this, Diana would spend the remainder of her time alone in her cell, incarcerated within the dark halls and cold concrete walls of the insane asylum. After several months of no progress, the asylum director, fully aware of Diana's strong background in finance, entered one of the psychiatric sessions and asked if Diana would be interested in assisting with the institution's accounts. Diana's eyes lit up for the first time she had been admitted, and she agreed, for she knew it would at least give her something to do that she enjoyed, to pass the time. Her doctor, however, strictly advised against it, Diana was a dangerous and unpredictable criminal who should not be trusted or left unsupervised at any time. The director assured her that she would remain in full facial and limb restraints at all times, and that she would remain under his watchful eye for the entire time she was in his company. The psychiatrist was clearly not happy about this arrangement, but had no choice but to let it go ahead. Diana was removed from her solitary confinement once a week and led in chains through the damp, dark hall, past the screams and moans of other inmates, to the asylum director's office. He treated her well and watched over her like a hawk as she was asked to siphon money from the government funds supplied to the asylum into a cryptocurrency account that would be nearly impossible to trace back to the director. Although Diana had been forced to hand over her directorship and voting rights of her company to her husband post the incident, she was still a qualified accountant and took responsibility for the transactions, a move the director would use in his defense if he were ever to be caught for the illegal activities in which they were both partaking. Over time, Diana became comfortable and conversational around the director and appeared to be making more progress in regards to adapting back to civilized society. She was, however, still completely closed around her psychiatrist, who was far from convinced at her progress and was also failing miserably at hiding her jealousy towards the relationship that was slowly developing between her patient and the director. For this, the psych began to treat Diana even worse. She implemented a program of treatment that would double the voltage applied during each subsequent electroshock therapy session. When Diana learned about this, she had a panic attack and a complete meltdown. This did nothing more than reinforce the theory that Diana needed the treatment more than ever. Diana was dragged off to the treatment room screaming. She bawled her eyes out and demanded to see the asylum director. "Who?" the psych fired back. "There's no one of that title here." "What?" Diana shrieked back. "Stop playing with me. I need to see the director. I want to see the man in charge." The psych began to play a game with her. "The one in charge? You mean the Emperor?" "Huh? What the hell are you talking about?" Diana shot back. "The Emperor? I need to see the director." "There's no director here," the psych calmly replied. "Only the Emperor, in his levitating chamber." "Huh? What?" Diana was confused, frustrated and confused, so she played along. "Fine. I want to see the Emperor then." "Oh, you do?" the psych smiled. "And how do you propose you'll get there?" Diana was quick to fire back out of frustration. "On my flying broomstick, of course. How else?" "I see. So you're telling me you want to fly on a broomstick to see our Emperor in his levitating chamber?" Diana exhaled. "Yes, that's right." The psych now grinned an evil smirk. "Well, it's completely clear to me now. You really are insane." Diana was petrified. She had no options. She was at the mercy of this madwoman. The psych gave the orderlies a nod, and within seconds, they had moved in on Diana and began the brutally painful electrotherapy. Diana was wheeled back to her room and then dumped on the floor. The massive steel door slammed shut behind her, leaving her alone in the dark in excruciating pain. She struggled to lift herself up. She knew that she either had to make it to her bed before she passed out, or it would mean spending the night suffering on the cold concrete floor. She tried, but couldn't do it. She was exhausted and her head was pounding. On the cusp of giving up, a hand came out of the darkness and took hers. She screamed and was suddenly able to right herself and make her way to a sitting position against the steel door. The dark figure then moved closer to her and put a finger to his lips. "Look," he said, "I can get you out of here, but I need your help." "What?" she replied. "Who are you? How did you get in here?" "It's not important," he replied. "Do you want to get out of here?" "Of course," Diana whimpered, holding back her tears. "Good. Then I need you to get us a map," he went on. "The one in the director's office, the one that shows the layout of the entire asylum. Once you have that, I'll help you escape." "Right," said Diana. "I know it. I can get it. Tomorrow. I'll have it." "Excellent. I'll be here," said the man, and he disappeared into the shadows. What the hell was going on? Diana thought to herself. I really am going insane. The next afternoon, she was taken to the director's office as per the usual routine. The director, having grown comfortable with her being around, did not keep her under his strict supervision. In fact, as per this instance, he left the room to liaise with other staff. Diana sat there in silence, working through the transactions, having completely forgotten about her encounter with the strange man the night before. That was until she looked up from the desk and saw the map. Diana finished her task and was taken back to her cell just prior to nightfall. She sat there, alone, feeling like an idiot. Why did she take the map? She would surely be found out, and then they would probably kill her during the electrotherapy the next day. She felt waves of guilt, regret, and terror wash over her. Sure enough, she was found out. The psych had been in the director's office and noticed that the map was missing. She immediately knew where it had gone. She stormed down the halls in a furious rage, ready to unleash hell on Diana. Diana sat in her room terrified. She could hear the psych's hard shoes clapping against the tiles, getting closer and closer. She didn't know what she was going to do. She had no defense. The door burst open and the psych stood at the doorway with a maniacal grin on her face. She was going to enjoy this, but before she could, she was pulled into the room and thrown to the ground, knocked unconscious. The man had returned, and Diana was saved. The two of them then wasted no time disappearing into the dark halls of the asylum and on their way to freedom. The next morning, the orderlies came to Diana's room to find what they thought was an overly animated and violent Diana. They wheeled her off into the electrotherapy room, kicking and screaming all the while. Once strapped down, they proceeded to put an increased dosage of electricity through the patient, sending her into a series of excruciating convulsions. Minutes later, the psychiatrist was brain dead. Back on the ship, Diana had drifted out of her deep dream state into regular stasis once more. And Dan Blacker smiled, for everything was coming together perfectly. Another successful kill. Dominic Franklin, pilot in the US Space Corps, lays deep in stasis, his vivid dream of being a World War II combat pilot playing out in his mind, feeling every sensation and sound as it runs its course, unable to discern the virtual from his reality. Addicted to the thrill of the chase, he toyed with the Japanese Zero for longer than he should have, and now he would pay the price. Looking down at his instruments, he realizes that his low fuel warning light has been trying to attract his attention for some time. How long exactly is of momentary concern as his engine begins to cough sporadically, sending it into scattered convulsions, desperately trying to cling to life, ultimately resulting in it flatlining. Dominic, trying to ward off any feelings of panic, desperately scans his surroundings for somewhere to land. Coming up short of any options, he realizes he'll have no choice but to ditch. He quickly attempts a mayday call back to his base, with no response. He fights the controls in order to get the plane to the surface at a velocity and trajectory that won't kill him on impact. He skips onto the water, still at a speed where it hits the fuselage like concrete, and in doing so, tears the wings from the body and sends him sinking down into the warm Pacific Ocean. As his cockpit begins to flood with water, he quickly manages to release the canopy and his harness and kick himself free of the sinking hull and up toward the daylight. Gasping for air, He clings to one of the wings which has remained buoyant, taking comfort in the fact that his situation is not completely hopeless. Just yet. The sun soon sets, and Dominic scans the stars to try and discern which way he is drifting, in the sullen hope that he will soon find land, for he has no food, no water, and no proper shelter. The following day brings no good news. Dominic lies motionless on the metal wing of his fallen aircraft, trying to conserve the energy and prolong the time before the tortuous chills of heat stroke kick in, along with the crippling agony of insatiable thirst and hunger. He rolls into the water in order to cool himself off, holding on tightly to the edge, taking thorough care not to let go, for it would mean certain death if he did. He floats upright in the water for the remainder of the day, his mind continuing to play out all the possibilities of his ultimate fate, and how he can possibly alter it, if at all. He lies there in contented silence, watching the sun set before his eyes, feeling a sense of peaceful calm wash over him, just as he is suddenly torn from the edge of the wing and dragged into the depths below. A school of sharks had been stalking him for several hours and had finally committed to moving in on their kill. Dominic rapidly fought in all directions, tearing himself free from the jaws on his boot and kicked frantically to get back to the surface, where he scrambled to get on the wing and keep his legs out of the water. Lying on his back in shock and in pain, he watches the fins circle as the light dims to deep darkness all around, praying that the sharks don't get excited and breach the surface to attack him, or worse still, tip him over during the night and tear him to pieces. The next morning, after a sleepless night, Dominic was exhausted, thanks in part to the relentless dull misery of hunger and thirst, but mainly due to the occasional knock to the wing, which, although not enough to tip him, was certainly enough to briefly stop his heart. Squinting through his salt-encrusted lashes, he inspected all areas around him, and to his delight, the sharks not only seemed to be gone, it appeared that he had drifted towards an island, with what looked like an American flag at full mast. Hours passed, and as Dominic drifted in and out of consciousness, he was certain to check he was still drifting towards shore, and that it was indeed an American flag rising from the jungle. Once on the beach, he rolled onto his back and slowly peeled his eyes open to see the silhouettes peering down on him. He was saved. He reached out for someone to take his hand, and he was met with a club to the head. Hours later, he awoke to the dim surroundings of the American camp. Unable to move, he quickly realized that he was tied up and was now at the mercy of the island natives that surrounded him. One stepped forward and shouted something in a tongue Dominic could not understand, as it held out the freshly severed head of an American soldier. Scanning around, as one of the more decorated natives began to shout at him, he realized that the entire camp had been massacred. The native was demanding something from him, to which he could only reply that he did not understand what was being asked of him. Dominic's response had no positive effect on the native. In fact, it appeared to only enrage him further, as he cried out in a furious rage and raised his machete in preparation to strike. Then, a barrage of gunshots rang out as the natives were all executed where they stood, each falling to the ground one by one, silent and lifeless. Dominic, shaken and blinking through the blood that had been sprayed across his face and eyes, looked around for his savior, only to see, from the shadows, a Japanese soldier emerge with his bolt-action rifle still smoking. Dominic was deflated. His time had come, and although he prayed for a quick death, he knew that he was about to be subjected to unspeakable torture at the hands of the enemy. He stared deep into the eyes of his adversary and watched in terror as the soldier's evil smirk peeled back to reveal the 2 rows of rotten teeth, which quickly exploded all around him, along with most of his head. As the body fell, Dominic stared at the face of the American that had saved his life, and then was overwhelmed with a sense of relief as he bent down to remove his bindings and take him to safety. Back on the ship, the androids administered increased fluids to the oddly dehydrated body of Dominic Franklin, while a team of others attended to the pregnant Linda Bjorn, who had moments ago gone into labor. The androids knew that she would die, along with the child, if they didn't pull her out of stasis immediately. And in a pod next to hers, Dan Blacker smiled, for everything was going perfectly as planned. Linda was going into her final stages of labor while still in stasis. The androids that surrounded her were unable to process how this was possible. They were very well aware, though, that if they did not intervene, the child would die, and most likely take Linda along with it. Pulling her out of stasis was not as easy as one might think, but these pods were designed in a way that each cluster shared resources and acted in unison. Bringing Linda out of stasis would mean bringing everyone else in that group out along with her. The deactivation switch was triggered, and the pod covers slowly began to ease open while the androids gathered around Linda in preparation to extract her and whisk her away to the ship's medical facilities. Slowly coming to, and burdened with the queasiness that accompanied being brought out of stasis, was Stephen Kushner, Gloria Aquino, Diana Larson, and Dominic Franklin. Finally, there was Dan Blacker, who, not suffering from any after effects, sat up immediately and began to lift himself out of the pod. It was time for him to get to the bridge and take control of the ship. The androids, perplexed at how quickly he had risen, were unable to attend to him as they were all trying to make sense of Linda's condition, for it was now confirmed that she was not pregnant at all. Dan retrieved a transport from the side of the room and began loading each of the other citizens into it, each of them still in a deep dream state and not yet fully awakened to the reality around them. Stephen thought he was traveling in a car alone with Dan, having just fled the murder at the pig farm. Gloria thought she was blind from the flash of the nuclear blast and was in an ambulance heading to a hospital. Diana was reading directions out loud from a map she believed she was holding in the tunnels beneath the asylum. And Dominic thought he was being rescued out of the jungle by Blacker and being taken to safety. The androids had attempted to speak to Blacker, however he just ignored them, and not having the ability to physically intervene due to their programming, they raised the alarm and a security detail was dispatched. Dan looked to Linda for directions to the bridge, what she thought was the exit to the asylum, and she began to convey them to him in a curt, clinical fashion as they sped off down the corridor. Linda's company had been the one contracted to construct the Soteria, and having overseen all major milestones of the project, she had intimate knowledge of its internal layout, from the main hallways to the restricted access service elevators and hidden passageways. As the transport neared its top speed, a large assault android stepped out onto the steel walkway in front of them. It raised its hand as a signal for them to halt. However, there was no way they were going to do so. Blacker shouted at Diana for instruction on a way around. However, she was oblivious to the threat and replied that he needed to just stay on the current course. With no time left to stop, the transport barreled straight into the torso of the android, severing it in two, and just as it did so, the android's rifle discharged, and the resulting projectile tore into Gloria's shoulder. This was not going to plan. Gloria, lucky to have survived, sat still in her dream state. Her eyes, which she believed to have lost, still fused wide open. Her vision, almost appearing to be locked on Blacker as a large steel beam protruding from the wall flew by and decapitated her in one swift slice. The transport spun out of control and Steve hit the brakes hard, sending them all sliding into the wall ahead, damaging the craft beyond repair. Gloria was dead. This was not going to plan at all. Diana, still believing she was in the asylum tunnels, leaned to Blacker and urged him to keep moving. If they sat still for too long, they would surely be caught. They would have to continue on foot. Blacker ordered Stephen to pick up the destroyed android's weapon. Stephen complied, still under the impression that he was alone with Blacker and that they had just had an accident on a dark country road, requiring them to abandon their vehicle. Moving off the road and into the woods, Blacker urged Steve to keep his eyes peeled and to shoot anything that moved. Blacker didn't like being this vulnerable. He didn't like this at all. They walked on for several minutes until they came across a small cottage with the lights on. "This is it," said Diana. They had made it to the bridge. The only issue now was to get access. The steel door was sealed shut. "I'll have to break a window," offered Stephen. "That door's way too heavy to kick open." "It's fine," Blacker replied. "I have a key." And with that, he lifted up Gloria's severed head to the retinal scanner and then stood back as the door slid open, allowing them access. As they began to file in, a blood-curdling halt shot down the steel hallway and made Stephen freeze in his tracks. "It's the police! They've found us!" he called out to Blacker as he opened fire on them, not landing a single shot before being torn to pieces by a barrage of gunfire. Blacker, having also been hit, picked up the weapon and placed a shot right between the eyes of the android, dropping it instantly before sliding into the bridge and securing the door with 2 extra layers of blast-proof protection. He then asked Dominic to take a seat at the controls and set a course for home. Dominic sat in the cockpit of the B-17 bomber at the US Jungle Airstrip and fired up the engines. He then pushed the craft to full revs as he took off and then made a slow bank left, turning the ship around in the direction of Earth. Blacker stared into the infinite beauty of space. In a little under a year, he would be home to rescue those he loved the most. His quiet contemplation was cut short by an ear-piercing shriek from behind. Diana had fully recovered from her stasis sickness and was once again fully conscious and panicking. "Where the hell are we?" Diana demanded to know. "How did I get here?" Blacker calmly responded. "We're on the Soteria. We're heading back to Earth." Diana stared at him in confusion. "But how? Moments ago I was with you escaping the asylum. It felt so real. What's going on?" Blacker explained. "When I was forced into stasis and hooked into the pod, I realized I was able to tap into the thoughts of everyone around me and that I could mold your nightmares. I was also able to hack into the life support system and make it appear that one of the citizens was pregnant, which ultimately forced the androids to open our group of pods." "But why?" Diana shrieked, getting more lucid with each passing minute, and slowly realizing that Blacker had sabotaged the entire population's chance at escaping the plague that had ravaged the Earth. "Do you realize what you've done?" Diana snarled. "I know exactly what I've done," Blacker sneered back. "Unlike you, I haven't abandoned my home, and billions of people along with it. You're the epitome of evil, Diana." "You know nothing about me," Diana hissed. "On the contrary," Blacker replied. "I know everything about you. Every vile deed you've ever committed. You, along with all the others on this ship, are the very worst of humanity, and you don't deserve to be the ones who survive." "Well, it looks like we're in the same boat then," gesturing at Blacker's neck. "You've been badly wounded. I doubt you'll survive the trip back." "I doubt you're right," Blacker replied. "Look a little closer." And Diana watched on in horror as she realized that his gaping wound was healing itself before her eyes. "I've got a feeling I'm going to be just fine." Diana reeled back in shock. "What? How?" "Over 150 years ago, I was captured by the Japanese in the South Pacific. For months, they conducted horrific experiments on myself and others. Hundreds were tortured, mutilated, mutated, and killed. I was rescued, but was left with the permanent side effect of being able to self-heal. When the US government eventually learned of my special abilities, I was kidnapped and locked away in an underground lab, becoming the subject of endless experiments as scientists tried to discover the secret to my affliction. When the Earth had gone completely rotten beyond repair, I was brought to the Soteria to be taken to another world and have the experiments continue. Who are you? Diana croaked in terror. I'm Dan Blacker, and I'm going to save the human race. The hell you are, came a call from behind. The pilot had regained full consciousness and had opened up the entrance to the bridge. Several large security androids stormed in and opened fire. Blacker leapt forward and began to take shots at each of them, landing a few off-center before being blown to pieces mid-air by the concentrated firepower. Blacker, torn to ribbons, then fell hundreds of meters into the piping and cables below. He was gone. Get this ship back on course, demanded Diana, and the pilot nodded. Then they made their way back down into the bowels of the ship and back into stasis. And there they slept, peacefully, undisturbed for several more months, awaiting a new life on a pure new world. Until the day came when the pods began to open and the citizens began to wake. And then the ear-piercing alarms began to sound, and the pod bay doors opened, and they were all sucked out into the icy void of space to their deaths. And Dan Blacker smiled as he turned the ship around and set a course for planet Earth.